improvisation, syncopation, jazz. Born in the Big Easy, roots from the motherland, Caribbean rhythms, and European influences. An ever-expanding expression of art and freedom with an enduring legacy. Unconventional, uncompromising. Jazz.
New Orleans is the center of the early flourishing and development of jazz because of the distinctive culture of the city that blended African-American, Afro-Caribbean, and various European musical styles all together.
Yeah, no, we got bop, 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 bop. The earliest jazz was absolutely influenced by African drumming, African rhythm. You know, in New Orleans, you had this culture of, Congo Square and different places, different venues, second lines and street performers and all of that. That's swinging.
People who not only were codifying the sound of jazz, but also spreading it outside of New Orleans for the first time are people like Joe King Oliver, Freddie Kepper, Jelly Roll Morton. These are all musicians who are born in New Orleans who become active in the music community as jazz musicians, performing in nightclubs and other places, and then begin performing in places outside New Orleans.
Like Chicago, like New York, like Los Angeles. And audiences now are able to experience that New Orleans sound throughout the country.
That music starts to hit the scene and people are like, this is different.
The jazz era develops at a time where innovations allow more people access to the sound. It gets recorded, it gets heard on the radio, and so a larger audience now blooms.
So the first jazz recordings are made in 1916 and 1917. Those records become hits and kind of popularize not only jazz music, but also the word jazz itself. With the popularity of these early recordings, you have jazz become the music for kind of rebellious young people, sort of like what rock and roll would be in the 1950s and later. Because of that, it becomes the soundtrack for the Roaring '20s.
Roaring '20s. Jazz swinging into the mainstream, riding radio waves, reverberating off the walls of dance halls, bars, and Broadway. Jazz was everywhere.
Now, the appropriation of the music, it really happens fairly early on because you have white artists as early as the original Dixieland Jazz Band in 1917 make jazz records and then actually go so far in their case as to say, we invented jazz. Most white artists were not that extreme, but you did have a consistent pattern of white artists being more financially successful, being recorded by what were the major record labels and kind of marketed more aggressively.
There were Black artists that were able to break through the barriers. You absolutely cannot deny the talents of Count Basie and the innovation of Louis Armstrong.
You had this cat with a handkerchief and a trumpet hitting these high C's like no other trumpet players could at the time. Duke Ellington was a huge culture barriers breaker in a sense because he had his orchestra. They were playing music that nobody could deny. Didn't matter what skin color you were, that music was great music. For me, that's why music is so powerful, because it breaks those barriers.
Like all musical forms, jazz evolved, pushed artistic boundaries, explored fresh sounds, birthing bebop, new styles like cool, third string, and modal, reinventing itself time and time again.
Bebop really emerged out of the long-standing culture among African-American musicians of prizing music education prizing the mastery of one's instrument. And so by the years right after World War II, you have this new group of young musicians who want to distinguish themselves in the increasingly crowded music industry by their mastery of music. You have people like Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker, and others. And so eventually this becomes its own kind of movement within jazz.
You move into those smaller ensembles and they're starting to play more notes in their songs. So more notes started to get jam-packed. And that also was a statement about what was going on, you know. They always were true to whatever was happening at the country inside of their music. So more notes meant more issues.
Free jazz emerges in the later 1950s, and free jazz is essentially improvisation that in some form or another is moving away from the kind of harmonic and structural basis that you associate with earlier types of jazz.
People like Cecil Taylor. It was this whole idea of the avant-garde, of the chaotic, angsty style, you know, of playing, because it represented a chaotic time in the country.
And that's free jazz, the ability to innovate and not be constrained by society's limitations.
A lot of writers have used jazz as a metaphor for the American experience for a couple of reasons. Number one, because it is an African-American music that became the music of all Americans. It's both a very culturally specific, and it also has a universal aspect that's appealed to the diverse population of this country. And then just in the nature of how jazz is performed in a band, you have the process of kind of negotiation, of listening, of collaboration, and of individuality that reflects elements of American culture, that kind of individualism mixed with that collaboration that you have in a democracy.
So jazz and the story of America absolutely go hand in hand. And that's what jazz music represents. It represents those baby steps that continue to happen decade by decade. You know, we start here, we can only play this. Now we can play a little more. Now we can let loose a little more. And that continues to happen. And that's the story of America.
Want to get a closer look at the impact of Black music in America? Visit and support the National Museum of African American Music at nmaam.org.